The Last of Us Part II released on June 19, 2020 and instantly became a contentious piece of media. Directed by John G. Avildsen, the Oscar-winning filmmaker behind Rocky, The Karate Kid is one of the best sports movies ever made. Some people love it. Some believe it goes too far in trying to teach players a lesson. Some feel it nails the tone Naughty Dog set with the original. Starring Ralph Macchio and Pat Morita, this feel-good flick focuses on a bullied high school kid who learns martial arts from an elderly Japanese master, and the result is pure 1980s magic. Others believe this sequel strays too far from what made The Last of Us so good. Regardless of which camp you fall into, you're probably going to know someone who feels differently, or you may read something online that takes an opposing view. Over 30 years later, people are still watching, and quoting, this movie, so perhaps it's time to put down those chopsticks and leave that fly alone as we look behind the scenes and find out why The Karate Kid is the best around. The inspiration behind The Karate Kid, the saga of Daniel LaRusso and Mr. This is that kind of game. All other facets of Naughty Dog's latest release aside, one thing people are definitely going to be talking about is how it wraps up. What does the end of The Last of Us Part II mean? What is going on? If you've played the game and aren't quite sure what to make of its final chapter, or aren't playing it but want to know the story, fear not. Miyagi all started when producer Jerry Weintraub, Nashville, Ocean's 11 was watching television one day. Below, we're going to hit all the key parts leading up to the end, and then explain what we think the ending means. Let this be a warning, this is probably not something you should read if you haven't beaten the game and want to play it at some point in the future. According to Jared Cowan of LA Weekly, Weintraub saw a news story about a local kid who earned a black belt in karate to protect himself from a group of bullies. Weintraub was immediately inspired, and soon enough, Columbia Pictures hired Robert Mark Kamen, pictured above, to write a screenplay. Now, if you've never heard Kamen's name, you've certainly seen his movies. There are heavy spoilers about the main plot of The Last of Us Part II, and this is not a story you want to experience secondhand. Now, let's get to it. The spark that started a wildfire less than an hour into The Last of Us Part II, the game throws its first curveball. The man has written films like Taps, Lethal Weapon 3, The Fifth Element, The Transporter, and Taken. Many believed, based on Naughty Dog's few reveals, that Ellie's latest outing would have her either rescuing or perhaps avenging her romantic interest, Dina. And when he was approached with the idea of a martial arts movie, Kamen was able to draw on his personal experience while writing the script. This isn't the case at all. Instead, she's avenging Joel. Early on in the game, Joel and Tommy, Joel's brother, are out on patrol in Jackson, Ohio. The two help a girl named Abby escape some infected, and Abby offers to take them back to the lodge her and her group are staying in. All seems well as everyone meets. After all, he'd been studying karate for 17 years. He based the character of Mr. when Joel and Tommy give their names, however, the mood in the room changes. Miyagi on one of his instructors, a guy from Okinawa named Mato Kuyagi. Abby shoots Joel in the leg and has others hold him down. And the character of John Kreese, the evil sweep the leg sensei, was a combination of two people Kamen had known in real life, a tough Marine turned karate teacher and a martial arts instructor who ordered his pupils to injure their opponents. Kamen was also the man who came up with the film's title, sort of. Originally, the studio was just calling it The Karate Kid Project. In a stroke of genius, the screenwriter decided to just get rid of the last word, and voila, that's how you name a classic movie. Casting Mr. Tommy is knocked out. Miyagi other than maybe Yoda or Obi-Wan Kenobi, Mr. Abby then repeatedly beats Joel with a golf club. Ellie and Dina, who are also out on patrol, are told that Joel and Tommy haven't reported to their next checkpoint. They go out looking for the two, and Ellie stumbles upon Abby's lodge. Miyagi is probably the greatest movie mentor of all time. She sneaks in and eventually finds the room Joel is being beaten in. She rushes in to try and help, but is disarmed. Of course, if the filmmakers had cast anyone else in the part besides Pat Morita, it's possible moviegoers would have forgotten about The Karate Kid long ago. Ellie is forced to watch as her father figure, Joel, receives one last fatal blow from Abby's golf club. Just like that, the main character of The Last of Us is gone. And so the story begins. A story of revenge from here, you likely have some sense of where the tale might lead. Morita is perfect in the role, and his performance earned him an Oscar nod for Best Supporting Actor. However, back in the day, Morita wasn't such an obvious choice for the part of a martial arts master. Ellie wasn't killed by Abby and her group. He used to be a comedian, and before The Karate Kid, Morita was best known for playing the comical character of Arnold on Happy Days. So when director John G. Tommy was spared, as well. Avildsen approached producer Jerry Weintraub with the idea of casting Morita as Miyagi. Weintraub wouldn't even consider it. He didn't want a funny man. Instead, he wanted to go with Toshiro Mifune, the Japanese star known for movies like Yojimbo, Rashomon, and Seven Samurai. But Avildsen was convinced Morita was the right man for the job, so he came up with a clever way to trick Weintraub into watching the actor's audition. Avildsen did a script reading with Morita and recorded the whole thing. The two talk about tracking Abby down and getting revenge for what happened to Joel. Some in Abby's group wore patches, Washington Liberation Front, that could indicate they're from Washington. Ellie wants to leave the next day and head to Seattle. Then during a run-of-the-mill meeting with Weintraub, Avildsen pulled a fast one, putting on the tape and surprising Weintraub with the audition. However, instead of getting angry, the producer was kind of impressed, although he required Morita to audition 5 more times before giving him the gig. Tommy talks her out of it, asking her to wait a day for him to talk to his wife, Maria, and make sure Jackson is still protected while they're gone. But after passing his 5th and final test, Weintraub admitted that he'd almost made the worst mistake of his life by brushing him off. Ellie agrees to wait, only to discover the next day that Tommy left without her, presumably to keep her out of danger. But there's no stopping Ellie. Ellie and Dina, her now girlfriend, head to Seattle to find Tommy and, more importantly, to find Abby. And Ellie's time in Seattle is riveting. She creeps through abandoned buildings. Realizing the error of his ways, the producer gave Morita the role, and the rest, as they say, is Hollywood history. Casting Daniel and Johnny. Believe it or not, Ralph Macchio was 22 when he played the part of teenage Daniel LaRusso, but despite the age gap, Macchio made for a perfect protagonist. She kills Infected. She discovers Dina is pregnant, and is joined for some of her outings by Jesse, Dina's ex and likely the father of Dina's unborn child. She manages to murder almost everyone who was in the room when Joel died. Coming off Francis Ford Coppola's The Outsiders, Macchio had some steam heading into The Karate Kid, but when it came to landing the role, his snarky attitude is what really helped him get the gig. After screenwriter Robert Mark came and met Macchio to see if he was right for the role, he came away describing the young actor as obnoxious, and really, that's exactly what Kamen and John G. She even manages to find Tommy. The person she can't find, though, is Abby. But no matter, Abby finds her. And that's when The Last of Us Part 2 flips the script. A matter of perspective, The Last of Us Part 2 then hands the story to Abby, who the player controls. Time does a little rewind, and suddenly players are back at day 1 in Seattle, experiencing the same days Ellie did but from Abby's perspective. Avildsen wanted. They were looking for somebody with an attitude, a guy who wouldn't take crap from anyone, just like Daniel. And wow, does that other perspective help paint a very different picture of what's happening in the game. Players learn that Abby's father was the fiery surgeon who would have operated on Ellie in The Last of Us. In fact, they liked Macchio so much that they kind of rewrote the part for him. The two were close, and it's made clear through cutscenes that Abby cared very much about her dad. Originally, his character was called Daniel Weber, but since Macchio was Italian, they changed his last name to LaRusso. As for William Zabka, the actor who played Bond bully Johnny Lawrence, he probably got the job thanks to some extreme method acting. On top of that, it's shown he wrestled with the decision to take Ellie's life in exchange for a cure. When he was first trying out for the part, Zabka got so into character that he actually grabbed Avildsen by the shirt, which probably isn't a smart idea when you're trying to impress the director. But in this case, it seems like Zabka's bad guy persona paid off because he was called back several times. However, during one of these auditions, Zabka got a little too zealous showing off his martial arts skills and actually kicked a hole in the wall. Still, all's well that ends well, and Zabka was cast as the captain of the Cobra Kai, creating one of the most memorable villains to come out of the 1980s. Busting the Chuck Norris myth, while Johnny Lawrence is the bad guy we all love to hate, John Kreese is the real villain of The Karate Kid. Played by Martin Kove, Kreese is a Vietnam vet who believes in striking first, striking hard, and showing no mercy. He's the kind of guy who assaults his own students, and he comes off as the quintessential martial arts monster thanks to a menacing performance from Martin Kove. However, many Karate Kid fans have wondered what the movie would have been like if the Cobra Kai sensei had been played by Chuck Norris. He was not a monster out for an answer by any means necessary. After all, Norris was offered the part but turned it down, right? Well, according to Brian Cronin of CBR.com, the Chuck Norris connection is nothing more than a myth. He had serious reservations about doing it, but ultimately came to the conclusion that it needed to happen for the greater good. Unfortunately, he was killed when Joel stormed the hospital in the first game to save Ellie. Since that time, Abby had been training and preparing. She knew if she ever saw Joel, she would kill him. When she got the chance, she did. The hero Abby's portion of The Last of Us Part 2 does more than just fill in some backstory. It also gives players a closer look at Abby herself. Abby isn't the militaristic villain she's made out to be in the first half of the game. She isn't bloodthirsty by any stretch. She doesn't go around torturing and killing everyone she meets. As it turns out, Norris was never offered the role, although if someone had asked him to play Kreese, Norris says he would have passed on the part. In fact, that's not her at all. Why? Because he thought the character cast a bad light on karate. Sure, that might sound a little silly, but it's important to remember that, despite a decade or so of ridiculous Chuck Norris joke, the man is a legitimate martial artist. Back in the 70s, he ran multiple dojos, and he was the undefeated world professional middleweight karate champion for 6 years. So it makes sense that he wouldn't want to play a character that might hurt the sport. Of course, we're just dealing with hypotheticals as he was never offered the part. Still, while it's fun to imagine Walker, Texas Ranger in the role, we can all agree that Martin Kove was the best choice, as Norris can throw a kick but isn't so great at reciting dialogue. The man behind the martial arts. When Ralph Macchio and company signed up for the Karate Kid, none of them knew much about martial arts. Sure, William Zabka was a wrestler in high school, but shooting for takedowns isn't the same as throwing roundhouse kicks. She's a pretty typical girl in the world. Abby has a favorite dog at the kennel. She has a complicated relationship with her ex-boyfriend. So to get them ready for a karate tournament, the filmmakers called in Pat E. She has a crew of friends, who she is far more loyal to than the Washington Liberation Front they're all members of. And she cares about other people. In fact, when she goes to check on one friend who's gone AWOL, she's captured by another faction in the game, the Seraphites, and is nearly executed. Johnson. She's rescued by 2 Seraphite outcasts named Yara and Lev, however, and decides to take the 2 under her wing and protect them, even if it means turning on the WLF. The game goes to great lengths to show players that Abby's motivations aren't black and white. This guy had studied Tang Soo Do while serving in Korea, and when he returned to America, he joined up with Chuck Norris, working at one of Norris's schools. In fact, when you take her entire story into perspective, and you force yourself to choose a hero and a villain for the larger narrative, Abby might surprisingly be the hero. Needless to say, this is not what many people were expecting. The villain Abby's largest chunk of story comes to an end when she comes face to face with Ellie. If there was ever a day from hell, Abby had just lived it. She woke up next to her ex-boyfriend. She helped nurse an injured Yara back to health. She watched Yara get gunned down by the WLF. She managed to save Lev from the middle of an all-out war between the WLF and the Seraphites. And then she returned to her ex-boyfriend's place to find he and his current and pregnant girlfriend dead, murdered by Ellie. You can understand why Abby wasn't going to let this slide. Abby uses a map left behind by Ellie to trace her back to the theater her, Dina, Tommy, and Jesse are in. Soon, Johnson racked up an impressive fight record, and not only would he go on to work with stars like Brandon Lee and Jackie Chan, he also had a part in Bruce Lee's Enter the Dragon. In other words, Johnson's combat skills were as legit as they come, and when he was hired as Karate Kid's fight choreographer, he got pretty creative when it came to instructing the actors. For example, he taught Macchio and Morita together so, as he put it, they would share their aches and pains like 2 little old men, and they built camaraderie through the training. He also made sure to train them in a very relaxed atmosphere, similar to Mr. Miyagi's style. However, Johnson took a very different approach with the Cobra Kai. He basically put them through boot camp, forcing them to do push-ups and treating them like soldiers. As for the actor who played Kreese, Johnson explained on a DVD special feature called Beyond the Form that he wanted William Zabka and the rest of the kids to view Martin Kove as an experienced black belt. Abby breaks in, pulls a gun on Tommy, and has him captive when Ellie and Jesse burst through the door. To create this illusion, Johnson trained Kove privately, keeping him away from the rest of the bad guys. Abby shoots and kills Jesse. Tommy tries to make a play for Abby. That way, when Kove met the rest of the crew, they would view him as a real martial artist and treat him more like an actual sensei. Johnson's methods were pretty clever, but his work on The Karate Kid wasn't all just behind the scenes. The next time you watch the film, pay attention during the karate tournament, and you'll see the fight choreographer playing the part of a mustachioed referee. The man who was Miyagi. While Pat Morita threw quite a few punches in The Karate Kid, he wasn't able to pull off every move required by the script. She shoots Tommy in the head. Ellie retreats to the backstage area of the theater, and after a brief fistfight, gets the upper hand against an unarmed Abby. So when it came time for Mr. From There, the player controls Abby as an angry Ellie stalks around in the shadows with a shotgun. Miyagi to do something crazy, like jump over a chain-link fence to give karate lessons to some bullies dressed as skeletons. Morita would step aside for a real-life martial artist named Fumio Demura. Born in the land of the rising sun, Demura specialized in karate and kabuto, a style involving weapons, and after winning the title of All Japan Karate Champ, he packed a suitcase and sailed for America. All of a sudden, Ellie is the villain. The two scrap once more, and despite an attempt by Dina to save the day, Abby is in a position to kill both. Lev, however, talks Abby out of it. However, Demura only had $300 to his name, and when he first arrived in the US, he was so broke that he had to sleep in a garage. Abby and Lev leave, with Abby telling Ellie she never wants to see her again. Almost a happy ending. Time passes, and The Last of Us Part 2 shows us that Ellie and Dina have returned to Wyoming. Dina gave birth to her baby, and the three now share a farmhouse. But fortune favors the bold, and soon Demura was opening his own schools and giving karate demonstrations at places like Knott's Berry Farm and the now closed Japanese Village and Deer Park. Suddenly a star, Demura was a regular on the cover of Black Belt magazine, and he performed in places like Las Vegas and Paris. Everything seems peaceful. Crazier still, he even helped Bruce Lee learn how to use nunchaku, aka nunchucks. Ellie and Dina are very much in love. Eventually, Demura befriended Chuck Norris, and it's said the American recommended him for the part of Mr. They have a beautiful baby to look after. Ellie even seems to have taken up art, as one room in the house is full of her drawings. The game allows players to believe that everyone will get some kind of happy ending. That's not to say Ellie isn't still affected by everything that happened, however. Miyagi. When Ellie goes to get a stray sheep in the barn, the little critter knocks over a shovel, and the clang instantly sends some terrible thoughts rushing back to her head. But according to Demura, he turned down the opportunity because his English wasn't good enough, although he did accept the job as Pat Morita's stuntman, doubling for the actor in the first 3 films of the franchise. But while Demura is the most famous stunt double in the film, we've got to give a shout-out to Daryl Vidal. She remembers Joel being beaten with the golf club. She recalls every scary moment she's endured, hiding from infected in dark, flooded basements. Not only did Vidal play one of the semi-finalists in the movie's climactic karate tournament, but he's also the guy who doubled for Morita in the beach scene where Miyagi throws his graceful crane kick. Basically, Vidal is the man who helped set up the movie's most famous scene, so we've got to give some credit where credit is due. The story behind You're the Best. The 1980s was a great decade for motivational theme songs, but few were quite as inspiring as You're the Best by Joe Esposito. She clearly has some kind of post-traumatic stress issue that takes hold now and again, and only when Dina comes to help can she pull herself out of it. It can't end this way. Ellie also can't seem to let go of revenge. This blood-pumping anthem plays during the montage sequence of the Karate Kid's tournament scene as Daniel LaRusso hits and kicks his way toward the big showdown with Johnny Lawrence. When Tommy comes and visits the farmhouse, yes, he survived again, he brings word of where Abby and Lev might be, claiming he may have tracked them to Santa Barbara, Caliph. The song is amazingly epic and over the top, but shockingly, in some alternate universe, there's a version of The Karate Kid that doesn't feature the line, "Never doubt that you're the one, and you can have your dreams." As it turns out, Esposito, who would also contribute to Flashdance and Coming to America, originally wrote You're the Best for Rocky III. Dina wants to let the entire situation go and move on, and wants Ellie to do the same. However, Sylvester Stallone decided to go with Survivor's Eye of the Tiger instead. Fortunately for film fans everywhere, director John G. for a time, Ellie agrees with Dina. The two now have a baby, after all. They're a family. Avildsen loved Esposito's song and incorporated it into his film, even though lines like "history repeats itself, try and you'll succeed" probably would have fit better in Stallone's film. In an interesting twist, Survivor would also contribute a song to The Karate Kid. It's called "The Moment of Truth," and it plays during the credits. So basically, Rocky's loss is our gain, and the song is one of the big reasons that we still love Esposito today. And being part of such an iconic film is incredibly rewarding for Esposito as well. As the singer once explained to Popdos, "I'm thrilled to have been a part of it, it gives me a little something back for all the years I put in. Don't forget, I'm in Vegas, singing in lounges, and sometimes it's a little discouraging. But when someone remembers what I've done from a movie, it makes me feel pretty good." Pat Morita's World War II experience. When most people think of The Karate Kid, they remember Daniel's bizarre training regimen or his final confrontation with Johnny. But in between all the fighting, there are a couple of little scenes that, while a little more quiet, a little more calm, pack an emotional punch. They have that to think about. Unsurprisingly, this causes Tommy to leave the farmhouse in a huff. But it turns out that Ellie can't leave the past behind. For example, there's a moment where Daniel finds a drunken Mr. Miyagi wearing a soldier's uniform while singing a mournful song. Daniel soon learns that his mentor fought for American during World War II, but despite his patriotism, his pregnant wife was tossed into an internment camp where she died to complications during birth. If Abby is still out there, in Ellie's eyes, she's getting away with it. In the middle of the night, Ellie proceeds to pack her things, only to be discovered by Dina. It's a poignant moment, and one that was largely inspired by Pat Morita's own life. Growing up, Morita spent most of his childhood in a sanitarium. Though Dina does her best to convince Ellie to stay, and all but says it'll be over between them if Ellie goes, it's not enough. As a boy, he suffered from spinal tuberculosis, and as a result, he was forced to wear a full-body cast for years. Dina cries as Ellie walks out the door to once again try and find Abby. Letting go Ellie eventually makes it to Santa Barbara. Thankfully, he recovered from the disease by age 11, but as soon as he was discharged, little Pat Morita was escorted by an armed FBI agent to an internment camp for Japanese Americans. She learns from a member of another faction, because all that exists anymore are groups who want to kill each other, that Abby and Lev were captured. They're being held in a prison of sorts a bit further down the road. Sure, he'd been reunited with his parents, but now he was stuck behind barbed wire, and he remained there for nearly 2 years, a prisoner who'd committed no crime. So when it came time to film this particular scene, Morita was instrumental in developing Miyagi's backstory. Before you know it, Ellie is back to her old ways again. She explores houses, opens drawers and takes whatever she can find. She battles infected when they appear. She guns down armed men and women she personally has no beef with, but who stand in her way of getting to Abby. And finally, after shooting her way through a building and releasing some other prisoners, she learns where Abby is. Abby had tried to escape. In fact, according to writer Charles C. Gooden, the song Miyagi is singing is an actual tune he heard while imprisoned. As punishment, she and Lev both were strung up by the beach and left to die. Ellie locates them, and upon seeing the two in such poor shape, it seems that she might let go of her grudge and allow the two to leave. Thanks to Morita, the scene is incredibly powerful, but nevertheless, the studio initially wanted to cut it out. But she can't. Ellie forces Abby to fight her, threatening to kill Lev if Abby doesn't comply. So the two go at it one more time. Ellie and Abby battle back and forth for quite a while, both weak and tired. At one point in the fight, Abby bites off 2 of Ellie's fingers. Ellie, however, manages to get the upper hand, and is in a position to drown Abby. Then she has a memory of Joel playing his guitar on his porch. This causes her to let up. Ellie tells Abby to take Lev and go as she weeps on the beach. Losing yourself, Ellie returns to the farmhouse in Wyoming to find it's almost entirely empty. Fortunately, Morita and John G. Gone are the decorations. Avildsen stood their ground, and the director believes it was this scene that earned Morita his Oscar nod. The Karate Kid lawsuit. It seems every time a movie rakes in the big bucks, it doesn't take long before someone drags the filmmakers into court. Unfortunately, The Karate Kid is no exception. Gone are Dina and the baby, and all of their things. All that remains is what belongs to Ellie, including the guitar Joel gave her. There is a song that appears time and time again in The Last of Us Part 2. The trouble all started when a karate instructor named Bill DeClemente filed a lawsuit, claiming the movie ripped off his nickname. DeClemente's moniker was indeed The Karate Kid, a name he heard sometime during the 60s, and he printed that title on business cards, signed it on certificates of promotion for whenever his students earned a new belt, and most importantly, he named his school The Karate Kid Dojo. So when the movie came out, DeClemente assumed screenwriter Robert Mark Kamen had stolen his identity. However, a New York court just didn't see it that way. It is Future Days by Pearl Jam. It's the song Joel plays when he first gives Ellie her guitar. According to the verdict, only a few people knew about his nickname, so he couldn't blame the filmmakers for such a coincidence. It's the song Ellie plays when she gets into a fight with Dina at the theater in Seattle. It starts with, "If I ever were to lose you, I'd surely lose myself." And it seems to take on different meanings depending on who is playing it and when. Sadly for Bill DeClemente, his case was kicked right out of court. The summer of 1984, when The Karate Kid kicked its way into theaters on June 22, 1984, the Ralph Macchio movie was an immediate smash. For Joel, may have been an admission about how much he cared for Ellie. It grossed a little over $90 million domestically, making it the fifth highest-grossing film of the year, and it was also widely praised by critics. For Ellie in the theater, it likely represented the same, how Ellie felt about Dina. In the farmhouse, Ellie tries to play this song once more on her guitar, but she's unable to. However, Karate Kid was hardly the only awesome movie to come out that summer. Her two missing fingers make it impossible for her to play the chords. In fact, if you look at all the movies released that year from May to August, you might start to believe that 1984 was one of the best years for movies in Hollywood history. In addition to The Karate Kid, June 1984 saw the debut of movies like Gremlins, Ghostbusters, and Once Upon a Time in America. It's here that the song makes it past the "If I Ever Were to Lose You" part and finally hits "I'd Surely Lose Myself." Ellie lost herself in her quest to avenge Joel, and lost everything important to her. Not only that, she lost two fingers because she couldn't let it go. Jump forward into July, and moviegoers were treated to films like The Neverending Story, Purple Rain, and Revenge of the Nerds. She literally lost a piece of herself. Second Chances, the final scene in the game, is a flashback to the night before Joel was killed. It takes place on Joel's porch as he and Ellie talk. By this time, Ellie is well aware that Joel had saved her in The Last of Us at the cost of a cure for the rest of the world. Jump back into May, and theaters were playing movies such as 16 Candles, The Natural, and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. The summer of 1984 also gave us memorable flicks like Red Dawn, Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, and The Last Starfighter, not to mention Streets of Fire and The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension. And then if you pull back even further and look at the entire year, well, that's where it gets really crazy. There was Nightmare on Elm Street, The Terminator, Beverly Hills Cop, Amadeus, This Is Spinal Tap, and Repo Man. If that's not enough for you, well, the Coen brothers also made their cinematic debut that year with their Texas thriller Blood Simple. She hates him for it, as she feels dying in the hospital would have given her life meaning. But that night on Joel's porch, Ellie tells him, with some of the last words she ever gets to speak to him, "I don't think I can ever forgive you for that. But I would like to try." The game then returns to the farmhouse, where Ellie leaves her guitar behind and walks away. In other words, when debating the best years for movies, 1984 is right up there with more iconic dates like 1939, and that's largely thanks to a scrappy little film about scrawny kid who learns how to sand floors and paint fences. Where she is going is certainly up for debate, and there will undoubtedly be many discussions about this topic as time goes on. But based on what she said to Joel, one could make the argument that Ellie is off to find Dina. If Ellie was willing to forgive Joel, perhaps Dina will be willing to forgive Ellie.